Okay, so our first presenter was the back end of a dragon at one time. She also worked with the great playwright Tony Kushner. She's part of an Americana band called Annalise and the Backsliders. She was a Moth Slam winner and has had her story featured on our radio stations, the Moth Radio Hour. And she's also a writer and improviser, and she's got this thing called, it sounds really cool, I'll have to talk more about it with her, called Sisters Rising. It's a group of formerly incarcerated women. So here is our first presenter, Annalise Raziq.
So I couldn't go to sleep until 3 a.m., like a lot of us. And I was telling someone before we started that, I'm going to fight with this microphone a little bit, that I was talking to people today, and I could hear words coming out of my mouth, but a couple of times I wasn't really sure what I was saying. So I thought I'd just use this little music stand here just in case I lose my mind partway through. My family had a lot of issues. Mental illness, alcoholism, violence. But one of the things that we got right was we were all readers. According to my mom, there weren't very many problems that couldn't be solved by a good book. My parents divorced when I was 4 years old, and a couple years after that, my stepfather, Bill, came on the scene. And when Bill moved in with us, we would all have dinner together, my mom, Bill, and my brother and I. And the dinner table conversation was always politics and the news of the day. And if you didn't know what was being discussed, then it was like off to the library with you. So when I was 11 years old, someone at the table mentioned Hiroshima. And I didn't know what that was. And I asked, and Bill said, go to the library and look it up. So I went to the library and I was looking through the card catalog. Remember that? Way back in the olden days. And there were a lot of books about Hiroshima, but I just picked the one with the one-word title because I thought, that's like the basics, I'll start with that. So, this was over 40 years ago now, and I can still remember what that book felt like, what it looked like and what it felt like. It had an olive green buckram cover, so that's like linen-y textured. And it just had on the binding just the one word in black, Hiroshima, and it had a plain cover. And it was a small book, both in dimension and in page count. It was only 90 pages long. So I checked it out, I took it home, and I started reading it that night. And it was not what I was expecting. So I thought it was going to be like a history book, maybe. But it was more like a story. It was profiles of 6 people who had survived the atomic bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima by the United States on August 6, 1945, which led to the surrender of Japan to the Allies at the end of World War II. Now, this book was famous, and I didn't know that when I picked it up. It was written by a man named John Hersey, who is a journalist. And at the time that it came out, it caused a huge stir because it was originally published as an entire edition of the New Yorker magazine. And the language in the book is really spare and journalistic. There's not a lot of emotion. It's very descriptive. So it was like this. Mr. Tanimoto was the only person making his way into the city. This is right after the bomb went off. He met hundreds and hundreds who were fleeing, and every one of them seemed to be hurt in some way. The eyebrows of some were burned off, and skin hung from their faces and hands. Others, because of pain, held their arms up as if carrying something in both hands. Some were vomiting as they walked. Many were naked or in shreds of clothing. On some undressed bodies, the burns had made patterns of undershirt straps and suspenders, and on the skin of some women, since white repelled the heat from the bomb and dark clothes absorbed it and conducted it to the skin, on the women, the shapes of flowers they had had on their kimonos. This devastated me. It still does. And I was angry, and I was heartbroken. And I couldn't stop thinking of the question, how can we do this to each other? At 11 years old, I was already really familiar with the human tendency to think about us and them. So my stepfather, Bill, was black. My biological father was a Muslim Palestinian. And at an early age, I had already experienced how they were perceived as other and how they were immediately suspect. But this book took it to a whole other level. And I started to realize that you can't do that to other people unless you find a way to intellectualize your actions, unless there's some way that you can disconnect yourself from the fact that there are actual people on the receiving end. One of my stepfather's favorite questions was, who are they? You know, you always hear like, they do this and they think that. And now, today, it's really current, and I am guilty of it. You know, and I can hear Bill, he would yell at the TV set, who are they? And at 11, I thought, they are the people that you drop an atomic bomb on. When I read this book, I had no idea at the time how profoundly it was going to shape my worldview, and no idea that it would open a door in my heart that would govern my actions more than 30 years later. So in March of 2003, when the United States was planning to invade Iraq, I could not sleep. I had a daughter by then, and she was 11 years old, so she was the same age I was when I read this book. And every night, all I could think about were that there were mothers with daughters like mine, and they were not going to be able to protect their kids. And so I joined a peace group, and I volunteered to be one of the people to be arrested in an act of nonviolent civil disobedience. And the group that I was with, they were all women, and what we did was we took pictures of all these Iraqi women of different ages and girls, and we made signs, and on the signs there would be a picture, and then above it would say, I am someone's mother, or I am someone's daughter, or I am someone's sister. And we took these signs and we held them over our heads, and we blocked traffic in the loop, and we waited for the police to come. When they came, they handcuffed most of us, and they loaded us in the back of this van, but some of us could still get to the cell phones that some of the women had hidden on their bodies. And so I got to call my mom from the back of this van and say, I want to let her know I was okay. I was like, I've been arrested. And she's like, I know. And I said, how do you know? Because she lives in St. Louis. She said, I saw it on CNN. And I said, what? She said, I just saw a shot of them putting you in the van on CNN. And I was like, oh, how did I look? And she said, pissed. And I was angry. But really, even more truthfully, I was heartbroken. And I was reminded of that when one of the grandmothers I was arrested with pulled a photograph of her grandchild out of her sock that she was keeping with her to keep her calm while we got processed for jail. I've heard people say that actions like that, they don't change anything. You know, we didn't stop the bombs from dropping. We didn't change United States policy. And I think if you think about it that way, that's true. You know, maybe we didn't change anybody's heart, except for mine. Because I don't want to forget what I learned at 11. I want to remember that there are people on the other side of the pronouncements that I make about them. And I want my heart to stay broken open, especially when it would be so much easier to seal it shut against the pain of the knowledge of what we are capable of doing to each other. Because in the end, that brokenness, that's really the only thing that I have to give. Thank you.